glad to see all the faces out here, and I promise that we will get you out in time to see the Ole Miss game tonight if you need to. And including one face, my Little League baseball teammate Brody Mullins back there. Hi, Brody. So we have a distinguished panel. We're going to talk today, as I think you know, about the long-term impacts of political campaigns and of campaign money on policymaking. I have an amazing panel here to do that. I have them listed on my phone in a different order than they're here, but I'll do this way. Luke Mullins, who has the book, as I'm sure you know, The Wolves of K Street. A little bit different than the movie The Wolves of Wall Street, but not so dissimilar. The subtitle of that is The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. An expert on campaign finance and really everything insider Washington. Paul Sparrow, whose book is Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh, and the Battle to Save Democracy. I was talking to Paul just a little bit before this. He is a former deputy director of the museum in Washington for 16 years, knows a ton about journalism and politics and history, and his book is the one I was most recently reading of these, and it has so many parallels of that period of history of Lindbergh versus FDR and what we're seeing now. And so I hope you'll give us some insights on that. Jonathan Karl is the god of ABC News, the host of many programs. I don't know what your actual title is. I should have looked it up.
It's some correspondent, reporter. Yeah.
You could see him hosting maybe earlier, I guess tomorrow you'll be hosting.
Yeah. I'm gonna try to take tomorrow off.
And his book is Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party, and he is a longtime Trump chronicler. You will also see in front of him there his earlier book, Front Row at the Trump Show. Somebody who I think has chronicled and understands the effect of Donald Trump on American politics as well as anybody in the country. So, a distinguished panel. I would have read out all of their awards and stuff, but I want you guys to think I'm the best. And if you guys don't mind, we'll move forward. What I'm going to do is ask questions for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then I'm going to ask you guys to be ready with your questions, because sometimes it's fun to ask the questions, right? Paul, I want to start with you, because we're talking about the effects of campaigns on policy. And you write about Lindbergh and FDR and their war of political words in I guess starting in the late 1930s as Hitler's rising. And what I'm really fascinated with is the sort of political context of that moment and the coalition that FDR is leading in the United States and what the politics look like for him as they start to engage in a fight with him, pledging neutrality at one point, or for a long time pledging neutrality but not really believing in it, and Lindbergh on the other side, advocating for neutrality and maybe not even really believing that. So if I could just start with, give us a little bit of the context of what the politics were at that time and how you see that having a parallel to now.
So Roosevelt had an unusual coalition. He had conservative Southern Democrats, members of the KKK. He had Northern labor unions. He had a growing support from the African American community, and he had sort of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So to manage all these groups, he really had to have a remarkable juggling act. He was also in 1940 running for an unprecedented third term. So a lot of people, even Democrats, opposed the idea of him running for office. He was accused of being a dictator or wanting to be a dictator. At the same time, Charles Lindbergh represented the isolationist movement. Right? Again, he was one of the most famous men in the world from his flight. He became even more famous after his son was murdered and killed. He went to Europe to get away from the American press and became, I need one of those. And he became very enamored of Nazi Germany. He thought they were a more dynamic nation. He loved their planes. He thought they were great. He would report back to the American military attaché in Berlin that how much more advanced the German aviation was. And when he came back to this country and the war started, he suddenly found himself supported by people like William Randolph Hearst, which think of him as the Rupert Murdoch of his day, and Henry Ford, who was the Elon Musk of his day. These were very, very powerful, very, very rich men who really opposed Roosevelt's policies and supported Nazi Germany. And they really thought we should be supporting Nazi Germany, not Great Britain. So this war of words back and forth was FDR trying to convince a majority of Americans who supported Lindbergh's point of view to stay out of this war, to Roosevelt described it as awaken the spirit of America. That the core value of America was our willingness to fight for freedom, even if we didn't want to. And so that was the context of this campaign of 1940, where you had Nazis providing money to American congressmen and senators to spill Nazi propaganda on the floor of the House of Representatives and then sending it out as Nazi propaganda under congressional, signatures. Foreign interference, you had neo-Nazis, you had anti-Semitism, you had anti-refugees, a little bit like today.
And Jonathan, kind of picking up there, we see some of these same themes, particularly, at least at a philosophical level, you see with immigration, the border wall debate, even this past week on ABC News, we had a debate about, a little bit about cats and dogs in Ohio. I'll close the curtain on that to make sure that it doesn't get any uglier. And we have this debate over funding for Ukraine, that's been going on in Congress. So we see some of that playing out now. I wonder how you see the campaign that Donald Trump ran in 2016 affecting the presidency of Donald Trump from 2017 to 2020. What was he allegiant to? What was just kind of said to win? And how that kind of set the tone for him for two successive campaigns after that.
I think that one of the incredible things about Trump is how little it's about policy. So you hear a common refrain from a lot of voters who say, I don't like Trump as a person, I don't like, a lot of what he says, and I don't, but I like his policies. But what are the Trump policies? And I think I've covered him. I've known him since the 1990s. I covered him extensively. The first network interview with him of the 2016 cycle. It was actually in 2013, 2 years before he came down the escalator when most people didn't think he was actually going to run. And I covered all of his presidency and now up to this moment. And he does have certain broad brush issues that animate what he talks about. Close the border down. The details, the specifics, how it's going to be done, not exactly clear. He's added that. He's added a new wrinkle to that, which I'm gonna deport 16 million people. I think last night he said 25 million. So I guess whatever. It's a lot of people. How are you going to do that? Are you going to go knock on doors and ask for people's papers, and then if not, organize the hundreds of thousands of buses that would have to be going out every month to get people across the border or fly them out on jump? How are you going to do any of this? So there aren't really specifics, but he's been consistent on that. Very tough on the border. He's been very tough on trade, tariffs on our trading partners, and he's been very tough on our allies in terms of we bear too much of the burden for the collective defense, for NATO. And those have been kind of his issues. I guess I would add a fourth, which is he was very focused on the color scheme of Air Force One. He literally
it's a very big plane.
Very, very big. He literally had a model of it on the desk, on the table that's in front of the desk in the Oval Office. But he's not really. This is not really about policy specifics. There was a moment where Donald Trump Jr. in 2016 approached John Kasich, who was one of the few remaining Republicans in the primary, saying, "Drop out and endorse, Trump. He'll make you, he can make you his running mate." And Kasich's answer to Don Jr. was, "Well, what do you mean? And what would I do?" And he's like, "Well, no, He's like, that's easy. You would be in charge of domestic policy and foreign policy." And Kasich said, what would the president do? It's like, he'd make America great again. So it's not a lot of policy specifics. And so, and you saw, because he had these grand kind of themes, and it was a lot about just being provocative and getting the attention, when he became president and he tried to act on some of the specifics that he had mentioned, a Muslim ban, that was one, you saw total chaos because there was no sense of how to actually implement these things.
Do you think, let me follow up on that, do
Yeah.
you think that because he had that experience, you talk about the Muslim ban, you talk about wanting to build the wall and then trying to figure out ways around the appropriations process, do you think that if he were president again, he would be more successful in implementing his agenda?
Well, I think that if he were president again, first of all, I think a Trump 2.0 would be very different from Trump 1.0. I think that there are many reasons for this. Two big ones is when he came in, he did bring in people to help guide him through this process. He was a stranger to Washington. I mean, he had very rarely even set foot in the city, had never been at the White House, didn't really, he had given money, campaign contributions to people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and by the way, Kamala Harris, but he didn't have the relationships, and so he brought people like Reince Priebus, who had been the party chairman. He didn't have a lot of Washington experience either, but he had a lot more people that would help him navigate that. Now he doesn't feel he needs any of that, and you had people around him who would try to kind of keep him from doing damage to himself politically, doing damage to the party, doing damage to the country, and they would try to rein him in. Sometimes by saying yes to his face and then undermining him behind his back. Well, he knows that trick now, and those people are not going to be back. They're gone. So that's one big reason. The other big reason, the other big factor, is we have the Supreme Court has given us an immunity decision, which effectively declares, to paraphrase Richard Nixon, it's not illegal if the president does it. I mean, it's broad immunity for anything that can be tied even slightly to official acts. So I think this is going to be a very, very different presidency, and I think that he won't let things like court decisions and advice from his White House counsel rein him in ways that he was reined in the first time around.
So Trump unbound.
Yeah. Not that he seemed particularly bound in the first 4 years, but I think it's a very different Trump.
Luke,
maybe not a different Trump, but it's a different way of operating.
Luke, I'm hoping you could do something for me, and I hope for the audience, because there's sort of I think there's this view of the world that says every time you mention lobbyists, every time you mention campaign money, there's this sort of darkness that hangs over, this sort of idea that people behind the scenes are pulling all the strings in policymaking, and maybe that's true. But I'm curious, like, if you could take us a little bit inside, your thinking on, and by the way, I should have mentioned before, Luke has had bylines in prestigious publications like Politico Magazine and Washingtonian. I didn't mention those on your introduction, but
okay.
If you could explain a little bit, like, your view of how much does the money in politics, the money that goes into lobbying on the policy level, how much does that end up contradicting what the public would want, or what is in the public's interest, acknowledging that those may be two different things?
Yeah. So, I mean, our book, we've really looked at public policy over the past 40 years. And, there was a time, in the 20s and 30s where, a lobbyist could make a phone call and, issue a $1 million government contract. That sort of magic phone call, that doesn't happen as much anymore. But what really has happened over the past 40 years is just the gravity of the amount of money and the amount of lobbying on the side of corporate interests has just sort of gradually shaped our economy in a way that suits corporate interests, right? Creating an economy that now really works well for certain people with certain degrees, but for many, it really leaves entire regions of the country behind. So it's really just the volume of the money, and over decades, that you know that has this profound influence on policy.
And that's the main sort of perversion, if you will, that you think that the money, more than anything else, favors corporate interests as compared to any particular set of interests or particular industries, whatever. It's the big masses.
Yeah, that's sort of the big. There's just so much more money coming in on the side of corporate interests. For example, there's not a lot of academic research on this, but there was a study from 2014 where a researcher talked to something like 70 different lobbyists, and he asked all of those lobbyists, in whatever specific policy battle you're fighting, who is the opposition, right? Is it an environmental group? Is it a union? Is it a consumer group? And every single person said, my opponent is another lobbyist for a different industry. Not a single person said, I'm fighting a union or I'm fighting an animal rights group or anything like that. So there's just this sort of staggering inequality in terms of resources. And over time, that has just shaped the parameters of sort of what is doable in terms of policy.
Can I add a thing? I think Citizens United also shifted the flow of money away from the lobbyists directly into these political action committees, because now the corporations can have direct control. They don't have to go through a lobbyist. They can create a political action committee, which puts direct pressure on these politicians to get what they want. It was catastrophic in the sense of making dark money available for manipulation of the political system.
Sure, and also empowering ideological billionaires as well.
Yep.
In addition to just corporate interests.
And
By the way, there's something on this that I think that we may heading new ground. It's transitions. We've had a process in this country for the last several decades of a realization that the transition has to start before the election. So the GSA provides some funding and office space to if both candidates if there's an incumbent, the incumbent doesn't need that obviously, but to the challenger. And there's a process. They can begin vetting potential cabinet appointees before the election, so you don't have a log jam. You can begin, and then you have these landing teams that go to the departments. So the Trump team right now is saying that they will likely not accept GSA funding, and they'll get their own funding for the transition. Because if you accept GSA funding, you have to then operate by a set of rules that mirror campaign finance rules. So you could have a situation where an Elon Musk can fund the transition.
What might be the potential negative effects of that, Jonathan?
Just to pick a name.
Suddenly the Defense Department is renamed the SpaceX Department. Paul, can you talk a little bit about with your deep experience in the media, what do you think we are doing successfully and what are we failing at as an industry in terms of covering public policy and how it's made?
Well, a lot of journalists don't cover public policy. They cover horse races, right? And that's what the American public is interested in. And so it's all about the numbers and the polls and the horse race, which is not really helpful in terms of what will happen if you vote for this person or what will happen if you vote for that person. I think it's a misconception that somehow there was once this golden era of American journalism where everybody was objective.
When Hearst ran the newspapers,
right. I mean, if you want to know about a nasty presidential campaign with highly partisan media, read about the 1800 between Adams and Jefferson. It was as nasty as you get. And back then, all of the newspapers were controlled by political parties. So this is not a new development here that we have partisan media in this country. I think there's a lot of great journalism going on today. The problem today isn't the quality. The problem today is the signal-to-noise ratio. There is so much noise coming in over the internet, TikTok and YouTube and all of these sources which are unfiltered. For many, many years, at least there was some editorial oversight of the information flowing to the American public, and now there's none. right? And most people are saying that they're getting their news from social media, which means their aunt posted a video clip of Elvis walking on the moon, so it has to be true. I mean, even President Trump said it in the debate, right? He said, I saw it on TV. Those people must be eating dogs and cats. So that's the problem. I think there's a lot of great journalism going on today, but it's so lost in the noise that this ability to filter out what's relevant and accurate versus what's entertaining and loud is our biggest problem.
Paul, you mentioned something earlier that I kind of want to throw to Jonathan, which is you mentioned Citizens United. And I think one of the effects that people have not spent as much time on, and Citizens United, for those who aren't familiar, is I think of it as a catch-all term for a couple of Supreme Court decisions, I think in 2010, around that time period, that really opened up giving and sort of got rid of some of the limits on giving to outside groups. One of the effects of that was to structurally weaken political parties. And the reason for that, of course, is that candidates used to have only so many places they could go for money. They would go to their donors that would give hard money to them, or they would go to the parties to give them money. And maybe they'd get political action committee contributions at $5,000 apiece. But now you can go to an outside funder who may be able to give you more money than the party can, who may be able to more affect your race than a party saying, hey, this is our candidate, which used to be the real power of the party, and which affected the outcomes in Congress. A party leader in Congress could say, hey, we want you to vote for this thing, and if you're not going to vote for it, maybe we pick your opponent in the next primary, right? So the parties had significant power, and I think that's been diminished. And John, what I'm curious about is how you see the two major political parties right now, because there's such an odd thing that has gone on, in my view, and maybe you'll see this differently, which is the establishment of the Republican Party hates its nominee in the last 3 presidential elections. And on the Democratic side, we just saw a political party, the establishment, get behind the vice president and decide that they didn't even want an open process to replace Joe Biden. They basically pushed the president out and brought someone new in with a minimum of political bloodshed once they made that decision. So what's going on in these two parties right now, where one is sort of completely, the establishment has seemingly full control and the other one has seemingly no control?
Yeah, it used to be, you could say if you were a Democrat, I don't belong to an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And the Democrats look pretty damn organized after that, I mean, just unbelievable events of this summer. Look, I think that the Republican Party has been completely turned upside down. It's worth just thinking about the convention that we saw in Milwaukee, where sure you saw Kid Rock and you saw Hulk Hogan, you saw some others along those lines, but you didn't see anybody who had been on a Republican presidential ticket other than Donald Trump, for basically as long as Jonathan and I have been covering presidential politics. I mean, there was no, the McCain family had entirely checked out. Mitt Romney, of course, is not welcome there and wouldn't be there. The Bushes, my God, I mean, we haven't seen George W. Bush at a convention since he was on the ticket himself in 2004. Mike Pence, Trump's own running mate, Paul Ryan, none of these people who we had considered as these kind of towering figures of the Republican establishment have anything to do with this party anymore, and it's completely remade in Trump's image. But the Republican National Committee, even though that is almost an entirely irrelevant operation, arguably the most important organization outside of the Trump campaign is Talking Points USA. Are you guys familiar with Talking Points USA? It's run by Charlie Kirk, and it was like the youth movement, the college movement, even though, did he ever graduate from college? Anyway.
I would hesitate to say because I would be wrong. I'm sure.
And it just gets, the kind of dark money that we're talking about post Citizens United, and it is basically to be the ground operation for Republicans this fall. But I mean, the parties, it's astounding how utterly irrelevant the actual party organizations are. And yet, and the DNC isn't exactly like a massive power center, but it was an amazing sight to see how Democrats were actually able to come together, and Trump would say rig the system, but I mean to have an almost seamless transition from Biden to Harris.
And really the second time, as I think about it, because in 2020 you saw Biden win the South Carolina Democratic primary, and then all of a sudden his entire party came flying in behind him. Which, I'm not sure, to the extent that anyone expected him to win the primary after South Carolina, and I think a lot of people thought that was a good indication for him, I don't think anybody foresaw, a 48-hour period in which everyone else dropped out, all the money swung to him, and it was over. So we've kind of seen the Democratic Party in the last few years change places, or even more with a once efficient Republican Party. So Luke, let me ask you that. What do you think what does the future of the Republican Party look like post-Trump?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, Trump has sort of tapped into this kind of economic populism, right? Which has divided the Republican, the sort of pro-Trump base from the establishment Republicans. So it's hard to say which of those two forces will be more influential going forward. There's just been, the party has changed so much since Trump got there. One of the things that we looked at in our book is antitrust, and the idea that the government actually, in a way that it really hasn't done over the past 30, 40 years, taking on some of these big tech companies. And there's a lot of support there among pro-Trump Republicans, and that's been a real big change. So it's hard to know what happens when Trump leaves. Go ahead.
Can you talk about the forces there a little bit? You mentioned pro-Trump Republicans wanting to step in and regulate trust and regulate some of these big businesses, which I think is new, but it also seems to be that there is more appetite for that among the Democratic establishment, certainly the Democratic left, than there was. What are the forces that are bringing them together, and do you think they'll actually be able to legislate together, to regulate together in a meaningful way that is sort of at the antithesis of the sort of, what do they call it, the uniparty center?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. As you say, I mean, Democrats have long been skeptical of sort of concentrations of corporate power, and more recently Republicans have been as well. It seems like a powerful, legitimate grassroots movement, sort of pro-consumer movement that again we haven't seen in a while. I expect that momentum to continue in one form or another. And again, a lot of this stuff is happening. This is happening in the courts, right? So I mean, these cases have been filed, and the Justice Department has won some, and they'll continue to play out for at least some period of time. The interesting thing is going to be to look at if Harris wins, there's been some pressure to potentially get rid of Lina Khan. Coming from...
Take a step back. Tell us who Lina Khan is.
Okay. So Lina Khan is the head of the FTC, and she's been, really aggressive and a leader in the effort to sort of take on corporate power, specifically with antitrust. And she's actually become pretty popular with some pro-Trump Republicans, in fact. But
Matt Gaetz and Josh Hawley love her.
Yeah.
They call themselves conservatives.
Yeah, exactly. But then there's been some pressure, from the sort of corporate Democratic establishment to get rid of Lina Khan. So that would be really interesting to see if Harris wins, what happens there.
It's like you have the potential for a new uniparty of this kind of populist, protectionist, antitrust, anti-big corporate power that you see that is the heart of much of what Trump is all about, and plays on a lot of the traditional Democratic. I mean, it is, and I think you're right to look at Lena Khan as a kind of a symbol of that.
Yeah.
And the flip side of what you're saying is Lena Khan stay on under a Trump administration.
Yeah, no, I've thought about that as well.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Paul, give us the historical perspective on this Republican Party riven over, isolationism versus trade and foreign, using our power in foreign places, and looking at what we were just talking about, not just the Republican Party, the Democratic side too, the sort of populism versus establishment, if you will. The world moves in cycles. History repeats itself. What should we expect down the road as we're at a time where I think, it's reflective a lot, of what you're writing about in your book and other periods in American history where we've had this kind of populism versus establishment clash going on?
I think you've got a direct line that you can draw from the post-Reconstruction movement in the South and the rise of the KKK, the turn of the century, and the neo-Nazi and the Father Coughlin and all of the anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiment of the 1930s and 40s, right up to the Dixiecrats in the late 40s, and then McCarthy and the anti-communist witch hunt. So you've got this thread throughout American history that's not necessarily defined by parties, right? It reflects a subset of the American culture, which goes way back. It was, the Democrats were the party of the KKK. The Democrats were very anti-civil rights. Lincoln was the Republican hero. So you've seen this pendulum swinging back in terms of the populist versus establishment within the parties themselves. I do think that there is a consensus building right now about having to go back to some sort of system where the two parties are arguing about policy issues. How are we supposed to spend our money? What is the role of government versus the conversation we're having right now, which is let's destroy government. We have a lot of people, particularly the MAGA Republicans right now, who don't want government to function, right? They want to eliminate the controls that government has over the regulations for their industries, for the environment, for labor, for all those sorts of things. So to me, that's not a populist movement so much as it is this sort of anti-government, anti-democratic movement, which again, you've seen throughout American history. I do think, though, that there is a sense now that we've got to stop hating each other and start talking about, okay, how do we move forward? What are the compromises? What are the grown-ups in the room going to do? What are the two political parties, which were always sort of the smoke-filled rooms with the guys making decisions behind the scenes? We need to go back to some kind of structure that allows us to resolve the issues and move forward, and arguing about where do we spend our money, not should we just dissolve the federal government entirely, which is sort of where we find ourselves today.
Well, I'm going to take I don't want to say devil's advocate, but take kind of an opposite position there and throw this at Jonathan maybe, which is it possible in the modern environment to move the needle in politics without being radical? If you want to diminish government spending or diminish government power, is it possible to accomplish that goal without starting at the point of, I don't think I've heard anyone say, let's end the government, even though that sometimes seems to be the pursuit, but without taking that to an extreme. If you're on the other side, is it possible to get more spending for social programs if you don't ask for twice as much as you actually think you need?
Good question.
Well, one of the arguments put forward by people, Republicans who were not crazy about Trump coming in, but trying to say the first time, having a silver lining on this, say, well, the good thing is, the system's broken. This guy's going to go in and he's going to really break it, and then we can fix it. He's going to disrupt something that is in desperate need of disruption. Let's face it, our politics don't work. But what happened is he didn't really disrupt much of anything. If you look, we ended up staying largely on the same trajectory in terms of our major problems. The most glaring thing is, the mountain of debt that we have, which Trump had exactly zero interest in doing anything about. He wanted to have tax cuts and he wanted to spend more money. This is not exactly the grand bargain that Boehner and Obama were talking about. One of his one of the crazy moments in 2020, and there were many of them, after the election, was when you had, another, COVID relief bill going through that was, as everything always is, brought together with all kinds of other things because the system wasn't fixed. It was still the same thing. We wait till the end of the year and we throw everything together. And it was an agreement that was negotiated by his Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, and by the Republicans and the Democrats, and it was all ready to go, and he threatened to veto it right before Christmas because he wanted more money on the checks, stimulus checks, and he wanted more. So, I'm not really answering your question, do you need to be radical to get anything done? But my point is that Trump came in with the idea, at least maybe this wasn't the idea the way he presented it, but people that were supportive in trying to find the best outcome is we are going to break a system that is true, that is actually broken, and this is the way we will improve it. And we ended up not moving the needle at all.
Jonathan, you brought up something that I hear almost never in any real way from anybody in politics, which is the national debt.
Yeah.
They love to talk about the national debt in terms of a bad thing that's happening, but none of them have any interest, seem to have any interest in addressing it. I have not, at least I would say since the Clinton administration and since George H.W. Bush right before him, the attention that people in power in Washington pay to actually trying to limit or pay down debt is only so much as it's helpful to them on the campaign trail to mention it, right?
Yeah.
Can I see a show of hands? How many people are worried about the $35 trillion debt that we have? Okay, so a fair number of people in the room are concerned about this, and yet it's not something that anybody actually puts any energy into in Washington. Republicans get in and they cut taxes in a way that adds to the debt. Democrats get in, they spend in a way that adds to the debt. Sometimes the Democrats find out ways to cut taxes that add to the debt, and sometimes Republicans find ways to spend to add to the debt. Yeah. Luke, what is the constituency for debt reduction with all the money that's pouring into lobbying and into campaigns? How much of that is coming from people that are dedicated to making, holding their feet to the fire of these members of Congress? What's the symmetry or asymmetry with other issues?
Well, I mean, the issue with regard to the debt is that the people that do care about the debt, these traditional Republicans, are out of power right now. So there is no constituency, right? Because sort of pro-Trump populist Republicans, they don't have a problem with the additional spending, and Democrats don't either. So with regard to the debt, I think it is a direct reflection. It's certainly the past, additional spending over the past 8 years, a reflection of just how sort of out of power that traditional pro-business Republican constituency is.
I mean, I know it was an emergency, and I'm going to take a point of personal privilege to just address something here. I know it was an emergency. We had the COVID emergency in 2020 and 2021 and ongoing. The amount of money that went out the door is staggering, where you're talking about multiples of annual budgets going out the door in a year, and so that you've
with very little control too,
right? With very little control.
Yeah,
and there was the control part, and I understand there's been an extraordinary amount of fraud, but I give the government a little bit of grace there because they did have to get that money out, like the PPP money, when commerce actually just stops.
Right, and I'm not arguing that it was unnecessary at all. Yeah. What I would argue though is that nobody stopped to say, how are we going to pay for this long term? Yeah. What are we going to do to offset the pain that we are incurring in service to that debt over time? And which, by the way, is not hard to do. Like, if you choose to do that, you can choose. There are a million different policy solutions you can come up with to offset the spending that you're doing.
And by the way, compared to the previous financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and Obama comes in and passes a $787 billion stimulus bill that not a single Republican in the House votes for, raising all the concerns about spending. But this time it was like everybody wanted
Trump puts money out the door, Biden puts money out the door. Yeah. They create, you guys will love this if you weren't paying attention to it, something called facilities for the Federal Reserve, which they ended up not using, but there was a possibility that these things could have ended up putting like another $10 trillion or so into the economy. And when you look at inflation now, some of that has to do with all the money that went out the door. So But there is no constituency for, the point I was trying to make is that there aren't lobbyists, or not very many lobbyists, to stop things because they are going to cause greater
The Concord Coalition.
Right.
Mighty.
The mighty. You might be able to name one or two organizations that are dedicated to this through foundations or whatever, but they simply don't.
Right.
They simply don't stack up against the interests that want money spent or want taxes cut without offsets.
Again, if you go back and look at the Roosevelt administration, though, you had the Great Depression, which was a catastrophe of today, almost unimaginable how bad it was. America was broken. 25% unemployment, 6 million homeless people. It was a disaster. And FDR understood that we had to spend money to get out of this. And it's the first time the federal government starts spending money and creating these programs to help individual people, whether it's Social Security or unemployment or 40-hour work week or GI Bill or all of these things, which they knew was going to sort of violate this code of a balanced budget. And FDR realized that you had to do that at that moment. You couldn't just turn your back on the American people. We would never get out of that Great Depression. Now, how did they fix it? When the war started, unemployment went to zero, and federal deficit went through the roof. And so, the idea that we have some understanding of what the economic dynamics are of these debts, or particularly the way this current level of debt has been created. What is it? What did Trump add? $7 trillion to the debt by the tax cut for the billionaires? And if you look at the top 10 richest people in America, their net worth increased by $2 trillion, over the last 4 years. So the money is there. The question is just how do we reassign it? And I think that's something that both parties at some point are going to have to come together and make some resolution.
Paul, I'm quite certain that you didn't say that food for a family of four will be easier to obtain if we just go to war.
Well, no, I didn't say that.
I want to open this up to questions. You should all just shout that. No, don't all shout out once. If you raise your hands, I'll call on folks. You, sir, in the corner.
Yeah, there seems to be a concern that the next Trump administration, if there is one, will be very authoritarian, more authoritarian. And I wonder what model people are looking at. I noticed in the debate, he quoted Victor Orban, who seems to be a man of Hungary. Is that what, is the conspiracy movement within Trump's coalition, or folks he associates with, Hungary is what the United States should look like?
Look, there is transition planning. You've heard all this talk about Project 2025, which Trump has disavowed. The truth of the matter is that Trump himself has spent exactly zero time thinking about what he's actually going to do once he gets in the office. He's superstitious about this. When people come in and they say, hey, we got to start transition planning, he doesn't want to talk about it. It's kind of like talking about a no-hitter in the seventh inning. He doesn't like the idea. And I think also part of it is the mechanics of governing were never what drove him. In the first place, he wants to win, and he wants to be the winner. It's pretty simple. So I don't think he spends a lot of time thinking about Viktor Orban's model and what he's done in Hungary, a country a fraction of the size of the United States, but he does like the fact that Viktor Orban has said great things about him. So I don't think there's a model, but I think the real question is what guardrails there are. I mentioned the lack of guardrails in terms of the people that would be with him coming into another Trump White House. But the guardrails of Congress and the courts and how he will respond to efforts to thwart what he wants to do. Again, his effort at a travel ban was stopped by the courts and had to be redesigned in an entirely different way. How is he going to react if he is stopped either through court order or, Congress refusing to confirm his cabinet, whatever? And is he going to press the limits of legality, knowing that it's kind of a reimagining. There's this theory, of the unified executive, which is again a variation of the president's in charge, and J.D. Vance has talked about this, and it's a very Supreme Court rules against you. What do you go ahead, enforce the decision.
It's fascinating because Dick Cheney was a big proponent of the unitary executive theory, and he is now against Donald Trump. And I think what it says a lot about politics, which is that they all believe that the president should be in charge if they like the president. Right. They don't like it so much when they don't like the president. I should also say, just for the record, I hear Budapest is lovely, but I would rather be in Jackson.
Yeah.
Sir in the back there?
Yeah.
So both parties and both candidates seem very much to be defined by their opposition to the other, much less so than sort of philosophical ideas. You look at the debate, which was on abcnews.com, TM, earlier this week.
Yeah.
There wasn't a whole lot of policy conversations that dip into the panel was kind of political campaigns, in fact, governance. So we have both candidates going in without a whole lot of, Kamala Harris is running in 5, and change is the incumbent. And Trump is running against Biden, even though running against Harris. So who sets the agenda? And no matter who wins, when a State of the Union is being written, when Congress is considering some sort of agenda next year, where is there just an inherent conflict between the party that wins, or the Democrats fighting with Democrats, or the Republicans fighting with Republicans, and whoever is going on the other side is just going to be against them because of the other side? How does that agenda affect since it's not a policy?
Paul, maybe you want to take that one?
Well, I think the agenda is sometimes driven by circumstance. I mean, you can have all the greatest plans in the world, and then terrorists fly planes into the World Trade Center, and everything you had planned to do is now out the window because the world has imposed the agenda on you. I do think that there are some clearly defined areas that are going to be addressed one way or another. I think the issue of immigration and refugees and border control is going to be something that the Democrats have suddenly gotten interested in this election, but I also think it's something that they realize they have to deal with. Now, they're probably going to deal with it with different policies than the Trump administration would, but I think there's recognition at this point that we have to do something. The rules and the laws that we have aren't working. I think you're also going to find issues around our willingness to intervene internationally. I mean, the war in Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza, these are not issues that we can just ignore. These are issues which are vitally important to our national security. How are they going to be resolved? Again, I think the decisions about what's going to be done will depend on who is sitting in the Oval Office, but there's no question that those two issues are going to be demanding attention. So again, I think a lot of times you can go into it thinking, I'm going to do this, we're going to revamp Medicare, we're going to fix Social Security, we're going to fix the environment, and then you get into the Oval Office and it's coming at you with the fire hose of these circumstances around the world that you have to respond to. So it's really hard to say who sets the agenda, that unknown force that controls the world.
But I think also go ahead, John.
But if I can just say, I mean, it is maddening, frankly, that we have a campaign unfolding that is so little about what is actually going to be done.
Totally agree.
I mean, you have each side says that if the other side wins, the country is basically in a free fall. I mean, Trump will say we won't have a country anymore. The other side will say, democracy is entirely at risk. And I mean, at the very beginning of this panel, Jonathan Allen went through, major issues that we are facing. And actually, there are some real fundamental policy differences between the two sides. I've got a lot of very specific questions that I would like to ask. I think I'll be slightly more fruitful if I'm asking them of Kamala Harris. Trump is going to go in a different direction. But I've got major questions for both of them on policy. And, with Kamala Harris, she is running as a very different candidate than what she ran when she was running in a Democratic primary in 2019, effectively to the left of Bernie Sanders. She has a very different campaign. I'd like to know more about, what her positions are, besides the broad brushstrokes, and how she wants to do them, and why she has kept her values the same, as she said, but she has decided the means to achieve those values are different. I'd like to know more about them. But Trump, in the campaign, in the debate, had no ability to actually put that to her because
he had the concept of a
yeah. We could be having a really important and substantive policy debate, but instead we have this debate where each side says the world's going to end if the other one wins.
I also think, and I won't put any political operatives who might be in the room on the spot, but like I think what you would hear from political operatives about the reason that you hear the negative about the other candidate instead of the positive about the candidate who's speaking is that it works. And they cannot make themselves popular, or try as they might, they are not always able to make themselves popular, but there's a pretty good formula for making other people unpopular.
Yeah.
And I always think of the best example of this was Harry Reid, the former Senate Majority Leader from Nevada. Every 6 years, it looked like he was going to lose in Nevada because only like 40 or 42 or 44% of the people said they could stomach voting for him. And every 6 years, he made the person running against him even more unpopular than he was by Election Day. And I think that's basically what plays out, that every time there is somebody cutting an ad, every time there's an operative making a decision about, or a speechwriter making a decision about what is it that we're going to message, the answer is the most clearly efficient thing to do is to knock down the other one. Donald Trump is now on his second Democratic opponent, and really the playbook hasn't changed at all. And for him to beat Kamala Harris, he's going to have to make her more unpopular than he is.
I'll just say,
Or at least that's the conclusion of political operatives. I won't predict one way or the other what happens.
So we have a poll coming out tomorrow, and since we're all friends, I'll give a little preview here. You won't talk about it outside of the room until tomorrow. So, one of the things, and we saw this in our previous poll, but this is our first post-debate poll. One of the issues that Kamala Harris has with voters is she is seen as too liberal. I think it's at 44% or something like that, say she's too liberal. A much smaller number says that Trump is too conservative. And that's because Trump has done a very good job, effective job, Trump and his allies, of portraying her as a far left, progressive, actually not progressive, communist, comrade Kamala, San Francisco liberal out of control. And because she hasn't had the opportunity to do enough fully explaining what her policies would be, and she's wanted to maintain this kind of, I'm going to go negative on Trump, but I'm not, everybody knows Trump, okay? You're not going to give anybody any new information about Trump in this election, but people know Kamala Harris's name, they don't know that much about her. And in the void of not doing interviews and not getting into these specifics, Trump and the Republicans have had an opportunity to define her in a way that can hurt her. So I actually think that it would do, negative campaigns work, absolutely. The negatives about Trump, they're already out there, that she would do well to do a little bit more to be specific about where she actually stands, the Kamala Harris of 2024.
Jonathan, can you share the top lines for each of the battleground states? In the back in the yellow.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm here with my 9-year-old son, a burgeoning political jockey. And
Hello.
I'm wondering if you can forecast what political journalism will look like when he sees a voter, not in terms of format. We don't know what the next Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, we don't know what that's going to look like. But the ability to discern truth, the ability to have civil dialogue, the ability to communicate with people and not villainize or hate or to get to substance ideas. Is there any hope that that can happen? Or what will political journalism look like when this guy votes in 9, 10, whatever, how many years?
What's your son's name?
Jackson.
So, look, I'll just say quickly, this may be more of a hope than a prediction, but I'm an optimistic person. I believe there is an essential function in our democracy for a press that doesn't take sides and is only kind of, look, none of us are purely objective. We're all human beings. But that our pursuit, what we do when we come to work every morning is what Jonathan Allen does when he goes to work every morning, which is to try to establish the truth as the best we can without worrying about not taking sides. And look, that has become something that has been under assault and is become harder and harder to do. But I think it is absolutely essential to the, now, the historian here is going to tell us that didn't exist when Adams was running against Jefferson, and that's true. We didn't really have this notion. We had partisan newspapers in this country, throughout our first century, more than our first century. So I am confident that he's going to be able to find people, whatever the medium is, after maybe television's dead, maybe newspaper's dead, maybe it's God only knows, where there are people like Jonathan Allen who go out every day and try to establish the truth and provide a way for him to make up his own mind about what he believes.
I'm going to take a shot at this, and I'm going to be the Rooseveltian optimist that I occasionally am. For your generation, you're going to have another iteration of technology which is almost incomprehensible for us today, especially for us old folks up here. And I think the advent of artificial intelligence provides an opportunity for a truly objective presentation of what happened today, who said what in what context, that if properly engineered, and your generation certainly has the technical skills to do this, if properly engineered, it takes some of this noise, the signal-to-noise ratio I was talking about earlier, takes some of the noise down and lets the signal get through. So there is a pathway to have a truly technologically driven, objective journalism, still powered by people, but that helps eliminate the misinformation, the propaganda, and the noise that makes it so hard for us to know what's happening.
Jackson, I want to tell you something. Oh, wait, you have a question. Why do you ask a question? Wait, but speak up. You might even have to yell. Don't yell, but just project.
With the electoral colleges, do you think it's better for what Maine does? Like with this part, basically,
Good question.
Democrats have like one part of this place,
Yeah.
and then the Republicans have 4 other parts, or do you think it should be all of, since most of Mississippi elected Donald Trump, then it should it be all, like, all Republican, all Democrat, or do you think it should be like,
This is good. He's good. He's good. He's good. Yeah.
Sir, you have nothing to worry about with your son. So let me take this real quick, because there was something I wanted to say to you, Jackson, too, which is, you know, when you look at information as time goes on, and we have a million sources of information and false information, misinformation, disinformation, like the best thing you can do to arm yourself, and this is the right venue for this, I think, is read. Read everything you can. Read our Declaration of Independence, read our Constitution, read history books, and you will be able to make your own independent decisions about what you are hearing. Read and watch and listen to, I should say watch, for those of us whose main vehicle is television. But being smart is your best defense as a human being, and being educated is your best defense as a human being. So just keep reading. And it sounds like you've been doing a lot of that. I want to take one just piece of this and then let you guys opine on it. Whenever you have a system in government, an election system like we do, with the Electoral College that is not a direct vote, meaning whoever the most people in the country vote for is President of the United States, any of the systems that you have are going to be some perversion of that, or going to be some alteration of that. So I can't say what's better or worse, but whatever change you would make, you would want to think about how that change affects what outcomes look like. And it's one of the reasons that you hear people advocate for changes to our Electoral College in one direction or another, because they know or think they know what those outcomes are going to be. We do not have that direct vote in this country, and anything we did to change it would have some effect, and it's worth thinking through those effects. You guys, anybody want to grab that? I think maybe
I like the idea, by the way. I'm not going to endorse it because we're just reporters here, but Maine and Nebraska do this, where they split the vote, I think that it takes a state like Nebraska, which wouldn't even be a factor. Nobody would really care. It'd just be Nebraska's going to vote Republican and whatever. But the fact that they have a congressional district that is up for grabs, makes Nebraska relevant. I think that having more states relevant is a good thing.
And I think on that note, because it's 5 o'clock and because Jackson killed it.
Yeah, Jackson.
I want to thank everybody that came. I want to thank the Mississippi Book Festival. I want to thank the funders of the Mississippi Book Festival. And on their behalf, even though I don't speak for them, we will invite the presidential candidates in 2028 to come here for a debate.
Right here.